Imagine walking into a restaurant, excited for a good meal, only to be met with suspicion instead of a warm welcome. That's exactly what happened to a black customer who was shocked when the waitress insisted they pay up front, something no one else in the restaurant was asked to do. At first, it seemed like a simple misunderstanding, but as tensions rose and questions were asked, the truth slowly began to surface. Was this just a restaurant policy, or was something much deeper at play? In today's story, we dive into an unsettling moment that revealed hidden racial bias and sparked a powerful conversation. You'll meet the customer who refused to stay silent, the waitress who stood by her decision, and the bystanders who witnessed it all unfold. Stick around, because what happens next might just change the way you see everyday interactions forever. As the black customer stood there, confused and frustrated, other patrons looked on, some uneasy, others too caught up in their own meals to notice. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah, had explained the rule before, but something didn't sit right. This was a new policy, and she was insistent. The customer, a regular at the diner, had never been asked to pay up front before. A quick glance around the room showed other diners enjoying their meals, seemingly unaware of what was unfolding. The customer, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, asked to speak with the manager. Sarah hesitated, her expression hard to read, but agreed. It was in that brief pause that the situation took an unexpected turn. As the manager arrived, tensions heightened. The manager seemed to take a different approach than Sarah had anticipated. The real question loomed. Was this truly a case of poor judgment, or was there something more sinister behind the sudden policy change? The manager, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, walked over to the table, greeting the customer with a practiced smile. He glanced at Sarah, then back at the customer, as if trying to read the situation. The customer, now feeling even more singled out, tried to remain composed. "I've never been asked to pay up front before," they said, their voice steady but with an edge of frustration. The manager nodded, as if understanding the situation, but instead of offering an immediate solution, he suggested the customer pay now to avoid any misunderstanding later. Sarah, standing nearby, seemed to brace herself for what was coming. It was clear this wasn't just a matter of policy anymore. The way the manager spoke, the way Sarah avoided eye contact, it felt like something was lurking beneath the surface, something that hadn't been said. Other customers, sensing the tension, started whispering. Some looked uncomfortable, others simply continued eating, pretending to ignore the scene unfolding in front of them. But the customer wasn't about to let it slide. They asked, louder this time, "Is this because of the color of my skin?" Sarah's face shifted slightly, and the manager's eyes flickered. For a moment, there was silence. The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Was this a moment of bravery, or an uncomfortable truth no one was ready to face? The tension was unbearable. The manager's face tightened, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire restaurant had frozen. Sarah shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact with the customer. The room buzzed with an undercurrent of discomfort, and it was clear people were starting to pay attention. Some customers were now whispering among themselves, exchanging uncertain glances, as if wondering if they should step in, but no one spoke up. The silence was deafening, and every eye in the room was on the table. The customer, heart pounding, stood their ground. "I've been coming here for years," they said, their voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "I've never been treated like this before. Why now? What's changed?" The manager cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "It's just a new policy," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something about his words that didn't add up. The customer, sensing the cracks in the manager's calm demeanor, pushed further. "Is this policy for everyone, or just for me?" The tension in the room thickened. Sarah's eyes darted nervously around, and her hands fidgeted with the pen she had been holding. She looked as though she was trying to decide whether to speak up or stay silent, but the moment was slipping away from her. The customer's question lingered in the air, demanding an answer. The truth seemed closer than ever, but just as the manager opened his mouth to respond, a sudden interruption cut through the chaos. A voice from the back of the room, a woman who had been quietly observing, called out, "I'm sorry, but I overheard your conversation. I have to tell you, this is not the first time something like this has happened." The words hit like a hammer, leaving everyone in the room on edge. The tension couldn't have been higher. Was the customer's suspicion right all along? Had this been going on in secret? And who was this new person, ready to expose it all? The room fell completely silent as the woman stood up from the back, her voice steady yet filled with an unsettling certainty. She walked toward the table, her every step punctuating the tension. "I've been coming here for months," she continued, her eyes locked on the manager. "And I've seen it happen before, but I didn't think it was anything more than a coincidence at first. But now I'm not so sure." The customer turned to her, a mix of disbelief and hope in their eyes. "You've experienced this too?" they asked. The woman nodded, her expression hardening. "Same treatment, different time. Same question about upfront payment. I'm not black, but I saw how you were treated, and I couldn't stay quiet any longer." The manager shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the woman and the customer, his face flushed. The air crackled with anticipation, the pressure mounting. Was this just a string of isolated incidents, or was something larger, something systemic, being exposed right here, right now? The woman didn't stop there. She turned to Sarah, who had been standing silently by, a tense look on her face. "And I've seen you give that look to customers before. You've looked at me like that too, once or twice. What's really going on here?" Her voice was steady but filled with an undeniable accusation. Sarah flinched, her lips parting as if to say something but then pausing, caught between the mounting pressure and her own fear. The manager's face had gone pale, and it was becoming clear that whatever was going on behind the scenes was much deeper than just a poorly enforced policy. The room was now full of spectators, some uncertain, others ready to witness the unraveling of a story no one had expected. The stakes had never been higher, and with every word that was spoken, the truth seemed to inch closer, but the way forward was becoming more uncertain by the second. The real question now was, who would speak the truth, and who would keep hiding behind the veil of silence? The tension in the room reached a boiling point, and for a moment, no one moved. Sarah's gaze flickered between the woman, the customer, and the manager, her face betraying the inner turmoil she had been trying to suppress. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but clear. "I didn't want to believe it. I didn't think it was my place to say anything. But you're right. It's not just a policy. I've seen it happen before, and I've been too afraid to stand up." The room collectively held its breath as Sarah's confession hung in the air. The manager's face reddened, and for a brief moment, he seemed like he was going to say something, but the words didn't come. He turned away, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth had become too much to bear. The manager, now visibly shaken, tried to speak up, but was drowned out by the rising voices of other customers, some now demanding answers. The weight of the truth was undeniable, and the atmosphere felt electric with anticipation. The customer stood there, processing the shock of it all, but just as they thought the worst had been exposed, the final twist came. The woman who had been speaking out suddenly reached into her bag and pulled out a letter. "I kept this for months," she said, holding it up. "It's from the owner. A letter instructing staff to enforce these rules more strictly for certain customers. Guess who those customers are?" She paused, letting the words sink in. "It's people like him." She pointed directly at the customer. The room was left speechless. The restaurant's owner, someone who had been a part of the community for years, was complicit in fueling this hidden racial bias. The entire chain of events, from the waitress's suspicious behavior to the manager's silence, was orchestrated by a higher power. And in that moment, the customer realized that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a much larger issue, one that needed to be confronted head-on. As the story unfolded, the community was shaken, but the customer, no longer willing to remain silent, stood tall. This was just the beginning. The room remained still as the weight of the revelation settled in. The manager, now speechless, knew that the truth couldn't be hidden any longer.